So for my final scene, I did this space-themed concept where uh, you have this evil building and the ship coming to destroy it. Um, and I'll just go through some of the points of interest and then go through the code. So yeah, we have the little hero guy here. And as you can see, we have some torpedo type things from the turrets that are uh, trying to get him. Um, and you can see that the torpedo is it's a model with a texture light, and you can see uh, how you can see it reflecting off the both the turret and the ship as they go by. I have them kind of a random uh, interval going, so you have four of them right there. Um, and while I'm up here, with the terrain, I was thinking kind of like a crater of a moon or something, and the planet up there, which is slowly rotating. Um, and you can see the gun shooting, and you can see that in the background the green fog. Kind of the idea being that the building is doing some sort of radioactive something. Um, and here's some more models. Thank you, Internet. Um, so here I used a set of four uh, kind of signal lights, I guess. They are uh, part of they're the unit pyramids, untextured on the color light shader. And I just have them um, just fading in and out like that. They're all four on that one shader. Um, and then, of course, here's the big evil building. Um, and what's good about this, what I liked about this uh, model that I found was that it kind of fits with what I was going for. And it's actually four different meshes joined together. Um, and so it's actually, um, when being rendered, it's not being rendered, it's divided by a mesh, and the texture happens to be the same on each. And I also have this created this little game object here. It's a textured unit cube, and I found this little kind of megaphone type looking thing that I use to kind of simulate a spotlight. You can kind of see the spotlight base right there, and it's actually pointing up and kind of illuminating uh, uh, a little bit a little bit off the ground. So, oops, you can see how it's kind of angled up to about right here, and then you can see how it's kind of brighter. And we look up, and then kind of the light goes away. Also have a kind of a second one right there. Um, those are all on the texture light shaders as well. And you can kind of see the outline of the spotlights on that. Um, yeah, and of course we have the skybox, pretty pretty standard. And the color lights, both the texture shader and the color light shader respond to the fog, so they both kind of go green the farther away you go. Kind of hard to tell. Uh, there we go. Now it's really starting to get there. Um, and so I'll go back down to the center. Um, and I have this uh, just this model of a uh, planet that's uh, both it and the skybox are on the texture shader. I didn't want the fog getting in the way uh, of that. of either one of those. Um, uh, and also, I have a little sunlight here so that from the distance it looks like it's really far away. It's actually just a unit sphere color sitting on the color, uh, the non-lit color shader. Had some issues with that, which I'll go into in the code. And I think that's about it. But yeah, so, okay. Uh, and we'll go take a look at the code for now. Okay, so I'll just start with in DXApp. I got sick of looking at it, so I pushed all of the actual scene related stuff into its own class. So um, all DXApp does is create the scene, update it, render it, and delete it. So we'll be done with that. So the scene class is where everything kind of takes shape. So uh, setting up each of the four shaders and then all the uh, models and textures and game objects or graphics objects. Uh, I also created some, I guess, some more specialized game objects, I guess I'll call them. Um, uh, one of them being the skybox and one the terrain, but also for each of the four torpedoes um, uh, that are being launched from the turrets and those two spotlights, I created separate uh, uh, objects, separate classes for them because they have specific behaviors. I'll just get into that right now. So for the spotlight, um, uh, it's basically what it's taking. It's taking both that the the base of uh, the unit cube is the base, and the kind of that uh, model is that spotlight model is kind of the is what I'm calling the light. They both have their own game objects, but what this class does is it basically groups them so that they can be treated as a single object, so that um, you can move, if you want to move the spotlight around or something, you can easily do that without having to move each individual, uh, each of the two models for its, in the case of the scene, since I have two spotlights. Um, and really, uh, uh, basically just give the option to add a spotlight and kind of this basically just joins the two together. That's kind of the simple functionality of that. Torpedo is kind of is a different, another special case because I want to take care of the movement as well as the lights, because the torpedo itself is a model, but there's also a light that uh, travels with it. Um, so basically I have a light and a model uh, together. And I created a class where you can kind of add light. You can create the torpedo. You can add a light if you want. If you want to change one of the parameters, you can. And then just some setters, pretty basic stuff. Basically, all it really does is just moves the light and the uh, and the model until it reaches a specified value, which you can specify um, in this uh, movement delta field. That and basically once it exceeds that negative z or that value, it just resets the original position. And then just for usages, just that's really all that you need to do is to create it. Uh, Really, this is the kind of the main thing, just creating the torpedo and setting uh, the direction that you want, the amount that you want to move for each update, and then add whatever light you want. Um, and yet this is just for setting that, setting the uh, Z value for when it resets, um, and I set the world origin at the front of the where that turret is. So there's uh, two for each turret, and then rendering is just a simple for loop. Okay, I'll kind of go back through from kind of start. So kind of looking through it from the beginning. So pretty self-explanatory. Just creating the textures, creating the models. Have the three unit models, and then a number of others that I found elsewhere. And then, of course, the skybox and the terrain. I'll go over that in a little bit. And then just basically setting up the general graphics objects for the non-specialized methods, um, non-specialized models. Uh, these are for the four lights around the building, the circling planet. Uh, Again, this is setting the world for those four lights. Uh, yeah, that's pretty much it for that. Uh, I did make it so that it would render, uh, sorry, it would, you would have to set the shader first. You'd have to make sure that the shader is set to context first um, before rendering the model. Uh, so um, let me go back to that. Uh, okay, sorry. Um, yeah, so, okay, let's just go back to, so yeah, I'm just rendering the skybox and the planet on the texture shader. Um, the sun is on the color shader, and then uh, we have those four signal lights on the color light shader, and then everything else is on the texture light shader. Um, so basically just group those by which shader is getting used um, to save performance so we don't have to constantly switch contexts. Uh, so we'll go through the, start with the shaders. So I created a separate kind of class for, separate base class for the shader color lights. Um, and it, sorry, looking at the wrong thing. So I created a shader light base that derives from the shader base, which basically just controls all the light specific shader information because there was a lot of things getting shared between the texture light and the color light. And so by moving everything out, all that we need to do is, that's all that's really left is setting the input layout. That's for the color light using the color light shader. Oops. And then texture light, same story. Um, so most everything is pretty much in here, including a single definitions of each of these classes. And so for the shaders, both the shader color light and the shader texture light, I made it so that you could have up to 8 point lights and 4 spotlights per shader. Um, so that's the data that gets passed. Here we are in the class. Um, so basically, this point light count will keep track of how many of the lights are actually valid, because I couldn't find a way in HLSL to do like a dynamic allocation or anything. Um, so I had to just say, I'll go take a look at the texture of the light. So in the shader, I let's see. Oh, here we go. So yeah, in the shader, I added in those light parameters. Um, Basically, we get the count and the spotlight count here, meaning that up to that many lights are actually present, so that when we actually loop through the uh, calculating the actual light colors, the pixel color inside the pixel shader, we only loop up to whatever the count was passed. So for the point lights, for the spotlights, that, and we only have the one directional light. And of course, the fog data is still there. And so, yeah, and then the color light, same story. Uh, 8 and 4, um, and yeah, still same story. And I basically used this, uh, yeah, this shader light base. Pretty simple, just setting up all the buffers and initializing the count to 0, kind of the standard light ideas that we've been using. Set point light parameters, and I uh, allow it to pass an index of which um, point light it's going to be, but I'll also have to make sure that uh, that the index that you're passing exists. Um, so you have to add it first. And it also this for add, it checks if it wants to make sure you don't add more than 8 lights. And then it adds that to the data and it increments the counter. And then same with spotlight. And then the sending the parameters as you would expect, um, just looping through each one. So that's kind of it on that. Um, the For the terrain, I was going through it, and um, I basically created this terrain class, uh, and really it's just a wrapper that holds the terrain model and the terrain game object, and so that when it's actually referenced in the scene, um, all you have to do is uh, call create terrain, or create the new terrain, set the light information, and then you're good to go. What the terrain class does is really just creates an instance of that terrain model, which is what contains all the kind of the loading of the model texture, height map, and the uh, setting up the actual model itself. And really, that's all the terrain model class is. Just creates the model and holds the pointer to the model, uh, and deletes that pointer when it's done. The texture itself, or sorry, the terrain, uh, pretty simple. Just calls render on the game object. Let's just set the color. Skybox, kind of similar concept, but with one less level of indirection. Just holds skybox model and creates a texture, or sorry, creates the game object, graphics object, uh, and it just standard uh, skybox creation. Here it creates the model and then passes that model and the shader and texture, of course, to create that graphics object. And then all that's left is just to call render. Uh, so let's see, close up some of these. So yeah, so since those are on the texture shader, that's all you have to do for that. Uh, for the graphics objects, let's look at the texture real fast. So for each of them were pretty much the same format, uh, except for the color, and I'll get to that later. Um, but just similar as what we've seen before, what we've had, just loading in the textures uh, uh, and allowing you to set a texture by a specific index in the case of a multiple mesh like the tall building that we have. Um, and so pretty much everything else is the same. The one issue I had was with the uh, the unit sphere. Um, so I ended up having a problem with it crashing inside uh, inside the model, the mesh separator. Um, so I moved it uh, just to get something on the screen. I added the old way in just for the unit sphere, um, and just so that's what that is. Um, and since I was only using that on the color shader, I just changed the color shader to address that. Not what I would have liked to have done, but time was a factor on that. Um, and so I think that's pretty much it. Let's see. Yeah. So, yeah, just, yeah, I think that's about it. So, yep, yep, here we go. Okay, okay.